In other words, if even intellectuals are subsumed into this.
There's always a fringe of dissidents. Any society you look at, there's a fringe of dissidents. They're treated badly, usually. I mean, this goes back to the earliest recorded history. So classical Greece. Who drank the hemlock? It was the guy who was corrupting the youth by worshiping false gods, you know. And it wasn't the guys who followed orders. Or take a look at the same time, the other ancient records we have are the biblical records. In the biblical records, there are people who we would call intellectuals. They weren't, in the English translations, it's called prophets. That's a bad translation of a very obscure Hebrew word, which nobody understands. And they weren't prophets. They didn't prophesy. They were dissident intellectuals. You know, they condemned the evil king. They gave geopolitical analysis. Said, you're leading us into disaster. You should be merciful to widows and orphans. These are dissident intellectuals. How were they treated? They were imprisoned, thrown into the desert. One of them, Elijah, was called a hater of Israel, Ocher Yisrael, by the epitome of evil in the Bible, King Ahab. That's the first use that I know of this notion, self-hating Jew. You know, it's King Ahab referring to the prophet Elijah. Yeah, and they were all treated badly. Now there were people who were treated well, flatterers at the court. A couple of centuries later, they were condemned as false prophets, and that's very typical. In fact, I don't know of a society where that's not true.
But I've heard it said, just on this point about you, that if the argument that you've just advanced in manufacturing consent was completely right, the book should have gone nowhere and you should have been an obscure figure who was shoved to the margins. But the fact that you are this giant figure and the book is still cited and quoted...
Not because of me, it's because of the popular movement. When I started giving talks about the Vietnam War, in early 1960s, I was giving talks in somebody's living room or a church with 4 people, the minister, the organizer, a guy who wanted to kill me, and a drunk who walked off the streets. And that went on for quite a while. Finally, a popular movement developed, and when popular movements develop, people who have some degree of privilege can float above them. Actually, the same was true of Martin Luther King. I'm sure he would have been the first to say, if it hadn't been for young students sitting in lunch counters and riding freedom buses and getting beaten to a pulp by state troopers and everything that grew from that, nobody would have heard him either.
Let's just, I said to you that we were going to just challenge a few things about it. The book was written in 1988. Since then, we've had this explosion of other media, social media, the internet, obviously, and access is now available to many who would at least consider themselves, and I want to hear if you think they would be right, but they would consider themselves outside the corporate media. They have their own voices, separate to that exchange and need for advertising, etc. And in fact, just to illustrate the point, I tweeted earlier today that I was going to have this conversation with you and elicited this question from a Chris Wood here in Britain, who said, can we still talk about dominance or hegemony in a world where there are so many competing sources of information and propaganda, the internet and blogs and Twitter, etc.? Does this change in the last 25 years render any part of your thesis out of date?
It's not a great change. Like when I was growing up in the 1930s, there were all sorts of radical newspapers, I mean, every imaginable kind. In fact, as a kid, I'd go down to the Philadelphia Public Library, or analog to this, not the same, obviously, and spend Saturday afternoon reading radical periodicals, every imaginable kind. And I got, you know what they were like. But there were other interpretations. Now, sources of information is not exactly correct because the internet access makes that easier. Like I don't have to go downtown to the library. I can punch something on my computer. But it's not that different. And they are not really sources of information. The information is still coming from journalists in the field.
But is that right? Because I'm thinking of some of in the Arab awakenings, in Egypt and other places, people were reporting as eyewitnesses immediately in real time. It wasn't going through the filter of any journalist.
That's how we found out about it. But if you take a look, the internet was used for, and social media were used for organizing in Tahrir Square. But take a look at what happened when Mubarak tried to stop it by closing down the internet. It turned out it accelerated it because people just contact one another in other ways.
But that's
face to face.
That is a profound change, isn't it? Because there you're saying that the authoritarian who in the past could have shut down the 6 state newspapers, he couldn't shut down
If
that.
they had, then people would have reacted the same way, by face-to-face communication. You've got lots of ways of communicating, and that's just what they did in Tahrir Square. In fact, it didn't even hinder the demonstrations.
So you don't feel that it's in any way made a change in sort
It's
of
a change, but
not in
I think
but not in kind. I mean, in
it's
degree.
much less of a change than, say, from the creation of libraries. I mean, that was a much bigger change. That gave people access to huge amounts of material that before that they couldn't have. In comparison, the internet is a small change, and which is fine. I use it all the time. I'm not criticizing it. But it's a little different from libraries, crucially different. In the case of libraries, you could be pretty confident that what you would read in the library is more or less serious. It had some value, otherwise it wouldn't have been preserved and stayed there. When you look at the internet, an awful lot of it is just total garbage. And if you approach it without any framework of understanding, which is what happens quite often, it can just be a source of deception. That's how a lot of contemporary cults develop.
And you don't. I know you told me before that you consider yourself a technophobe. You don't use social media yourself.
I don't use social media at all. I don't like them for other reasons. It seems to me they create. I can see with my grandchildren. They create very superficial appearances of relationships. Like a kid, thinking of a case, will write on Facebook, I'm having an exam this afternoon, and immediately 100 so-called friends will write back, who she never heard from, saying, gee, I hope you do well. And the kid thinks she has 100 friends. It's nothing, It's just replacing real friends by virtual friends.
For somebody who doesn't use social media, I think you've got quite a good grasp of the teenage thing going on there.
I've got experimental subjects.
In the form of your grandchildren. I should promise that we are going to open this out to wider conversation and soon. There's a couple of areas I just want to probe before we do. Another change that's happened besides the internet change has been a kind of fragmentation of the big media that was still there in a big way in 1988. Decline of the big city newspapers would be one phenomenon, but for example, cable television. So there is now Fox News on the right and an MSNBC News on the left. That feels like a proliferation, a range of views, or for you, are they just two heads of the same corporate beast?
I think if you look over the last, say, my lifetime, my conscious lifetime, last 70 years, say, there's been a narrowing of media, sharp narrowing, in England too. Remember that as late as the 1960s, the British tabloids, which are beyond junk, were serious newspapers, mainly labor newspapers, and pretty serious ones. The New York Post, which is a tabloid, that was the left-wing newspaper. Now it's beyond idiocy. The Daily Herald, I think it was the best-selling newspaper in England until the early 60s. It was a social democratic labor newspaper. It also had a lot of loyalty, reader loyalty. People read it. It was serious. It couldn't survive capital concentration in advertising. And in fact, if you look back from the 19th century till today, there's been a sharp narrowing of media. In the 19th century, there was a huge proliferation of media. Labor press, ethnic press, all kinds of things.
But all these things are now there, aren't they, on the internet? But all these things are there now, aren't they, on the internet as blogs for every possible political
but
strand?
then they were actually They were serious newspapers that people participated in. And it wasn't just anything that comes to mind. I'll write it down. They were committed, and they're very interesting. In fact, there's a very good book, which maybe some of you have read, on the reading habits of the British working class. Jonathan Rose, a big 800-page book, and it's fascinating. He points out, he concludes that working people in England had a richer cultural life than the aristocrats because they were really reading serious work. The same in the United States. You take a look at the labor press in the late 19th century. The press was written by Irish artisans from going to the mills, what they called factory girls, young women from the farms who were essentially being driven into the mills as the early Industrial Revolution. And it's very interesting, very insightful, very for them, there was no Marx, no European socialism, never heard about that. They were just writing from their own experience of the degrading character of the industrial system, which was destroying their culture, their independence, their freedom. In fact, one of the interesting things which is relevant, one of the things they denounced was what they called, this is 1850, the new spirit of the age. Gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Did you ever hear that? That was the new spirit of the age in 1850, and they were bitterly condemning it. And there's been 150 years of intense propaganda to get this sociopathic concept into people's heads. They were resisting it, much less now. And even in my childhood, there was still a wide proliferation of newspapers. I mean, in Philadelphia, where I lived, in those days, there was a morning paper and an evening paper, and then you got the New York papers, and it was quite a range.